People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. A few days ago, Sri Lanka voted into office its 9th executive president, Anura Kumara Dissanayake, who said in his address to the nation, among other things, "We are inheriting a nation in deep crisis. I am not a conjurer, I am not a magician." How must the president now go about navigating a multidimensionally complex terrain? To share his perspectives on the best way forward, I'm so pleased to welcome back to the studio Murtaza Jafferjee, chairman of the Advocata Institute. Good evening and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sonali, for inviting me. It's
Absolutely.
my pleasure to be here today.
To start things off, how must the president of Sri Lanka now go about navigating this multi-dimensionally complex task, which is navigating forth the nation?
So the first thing he has to do is that he has announced by 15 November there will be a parliamentary election. The Sri Lankan executive president has enormous amount of power. There's a huge concentration of power, but he still needs the support of parliament to pass legislation, to pass the budget, and there have been recent changes to some of the laws that require more involvement of parliament. The parliamentary committees play a very important role in oversight. So they have dissolved parliament at the moment, and I think his number one priority is to speedily have a parliamentary election and for them to get a majority, ideally without any coalition partners, because he was not excessively populist and he was not divisive in his presidential campaign, and therefore it is important that his party basically, without giving up too many concessions or straying too much from their key beliefs, that they get a parliamentary majority. So I think the first step is that they need to do that, and in the interim period they have to show their ability to govern. They also have to speedily finish on the economic side the third review with the IMF. I believe a delegation is due sometime next week, and then they have to speedily complete the debt restructuring. Both those points, I believe, in his address to the nation a couple of days ago, he reiterated that he would be looking to complete it as soon as possible.
If we take the IMF supported program, which is one of the key concerns that is looming, what would be the nature of discussions? We're looking at a delegation from the IMF coming to Sri Lanka next week.
So one has to understand that the IMF support for Sri Lanka is of the nature of about $3 billion, but that money basically is for gap funding. So when they design the program, they have an estimate, they have a forecast of how the economy will do, and then they also factor in what kind of external support will come from multilateral agencies like the World Bank, ADB. And the money that the IMF provides is only to fund the residual. But when you are in an IMF program, you are basically healing yourself, because there have been imbalances in your economy. That is how you got into a balance of payment crisis. And in Sri Lanka's case, there was excessive amount of consumption and investment because of loose monetary and fiscal policy. So the program is designed to correct those things. In the case of monetary policy, the key piece of legislation was an independent central bank, and that was a game-changing piece of legislation, because monetary financing, or what is better known as money printing, is disallowed, although the existing money lent to the government will be only wound down over 15 years, starting in about 5 years time. And there is also tighter fiscal policy, this whole concept of running a primary balance surplus. And most of the fiscal support, fiscal requirements are revenue based consolidation. So they are not advocating cutting spending. It is mainly to increase revenue, because Sri Lanka doesn't have a spending problem. We have very high interest, which is like 8% of GDP, but what we are spending is not a major issue. So when the IMF comes here, basically they will complete the third review. I think most of the targets we have already met. They want to see what the future policies are going to be. Right. That is why it was postponed, because they knew that a new executive was going to come in. So if they get assurances that the policy will be consistent with the targets of the IMF program, it will get approved. The fourth tranche will come through, and the most important factor is funding from the ADB and the World Bank, totaling about $700 million will be released.
Right. Okay. So one of the key prerequisites of the IMF, which also aligned with the NPP's political manifesto and slogan, is that of anti-corruption. A cursory reading of the IMF's governance diagnostic report released last year shows how corruption is one of the key destroying factors of the Sri Lankan economy. Speak to us about what the future will look like.
Okay. So if I can first start with taking a quick step back. Corruption is defined as the abuse of public office for private gain. And there are two basic types of corruption: political corruption and bureaucratic corruption. Now what the IMF did for us, we were the first country in Asia to do it. They have done assessments in Latin America, in Africa, in Eastern Europe. They did a governance diagnostic assessment, and they identified across 6 or 7 dimensions the anti-corruption, the framework in Sri Lanka, about rule of law, about the central bank, about the fiscal side, and one other. And they came up with a 120-page report, basically giving recommendations how to reduce corruption vulnerabilities. Right? Then they came up with 16 priority recommendations. There are over 90 recommendations, basically. So as part of the conditionalities of our program, what I call structural benchmarks, we have to implement those 16 recommendations. Since I had to analyze most of the political manifestos, I recollect that many of those recommendations are already in the NPP's manifesto. Okay. And in the annexure 2 to the report, the IMF didn't say that it's a priority recommendation, but they argued of the benefits of what is called an independent public prosecutor. Because at the moment our Attorney General's department is a public prosecutor, but they are also the advisor to the government and defender of the government. So the IMF said that there's a conflict here. I believe the NPP manifesto had the desire to set up an independent public prosecutor, but that will take time because you are setting up a completely new institution. So I don't think that can happen in a few months. I think it will take 2 years. Right. So that's how to prevent corruption. Then you have fighting corruption, and that is, we already have a new law, anti-corruption law, and we have an agency called SIABOC. Now the first thing that they have to do is they have to fund SIABOC adequately, very well funded, so that they can get high caliber talent and give them a mandate that they will not interfere to go after the cases. There's already a number of cases, and as you know, it is not only public sector corruption, private sector corruption is also there.
Mr. Jafferjee, I'd also like your perspectives on how the government must work on combating economic disenfranchisement. Recently, a UN agency released a report, I think it was the UNDP, where it identified multidimensional vulnerability across sectors. there is a cost of living crisis in Sri Lanka, and it is the vulnerable, the marginalized who bear the brunt of this. Speak to us about that aspect.
All right. So just to explain how income is distributed, from national income, the 10% of the richest households get 36%, and the next 10% in total, that is the top 20%, get 51% of national income. The bottom 10% get only 1.6%, and the bottom 20% get 4.6%. Now this structure has not changed for many decades. If you look at this comes from something called the Household Income and Expenditure Survey, that even if you go back many decades, the structure has remained. So I don't think inequality has increased over the decades, although after the crisis a survey has not been done, because the last survey was done in 2019. So what we need to do is that the vulnerable who has got significantly impacted by this crisis, because inflation hits them harder because they don't have a lot of real assets. So the cost of living goes up, the prices of goods go up, their incomes don't necessarily scale up basically. So even the design of the IMF program, they insisted that whatever targets are met, it will be only measured after the agreed minimum amount of social safety spending is done, which I recollect about 220 billion, which is not a lot of money. It's only 0.8% of GDP. And we have finally, after many failures, got the right mechanism to do that, which is called Aswasuma. So Aswasuma is a cash transfer program, and what they do is that they try to compute what is called your vulnerability, deprivation. They score. They measure something called deprivation on 22 dimensions, 22 indicators across 6 dimensions.
Okay.
Age, whether you have diseases, chronic diseases, whether you are educated, many such things. And depending on your deprivation score, you are eligible for a certain amount of cash transfer. Now, that is the best way to do this. We should not meddle with price-based subsidies, etc. Because what happens is that when you try to make things affordable through prices, people like me benefit, and I have much more income and my spending power is much more. So what's the point of giving me relief? So there are 2 dimensions on how to help the vulnerable. One is try to get opportunities for them to earn more income. So there is now a recovery sonali in the economy, and tourism is obviously one of the sunrise sectors, and finally they fixed this visa issue. So we should have a very good season coming up. The second dimension to cost of living is the price of goods. And if we have reasonable economic policies, including more open trade, I believe that cost of many items can come down. So one way of improving the affordability is people earning more income. Second thing is the price of some goods can come down.
This next question is a very simplistic one, but many of us don't have a background in economics, so I will go ahead and ask you this. Recently, the prices of eggs went down by about 10 rupees, but this benefit wasn't passed on to the customers. The cakes I purchased were still the same price. So, and we see this at a macro level when it comes to a decline in the prices of goods and services, or ingredients or raw materials or production vegetables. This benefit isn't passed down to the customer.
So economists call this that prices are sticky, and it's not only in Sri Lanka, in many parts of the world, that the transmission does not happen instantaneously. Sometimes, although the purists will say that prices are set at the margin and the propagation should happen almost immediately, but what happens is that people have stocks at all prices, or they have some losses previously which they are trying to recover. And the best way for that to happen is to have more and more competition, because if you look at many of the markets for goods in Sri Lanka, the competition is very low, so contestability or the threat of competition has to be increased. Now, one way to do that is to have free trade, and there is a muddled thinking that we need to produce more things. That's not correct. I mean, even if we don't get imports, if the threat of imports is there, that is sufficient to keep prices down.
Okay.
Right. So the simple answer to your question is more competition, but sometimes right after a drop in prices of certain raw materials, you will not see a corresponding drop in finished goods or intermediate goods. There is a time lag. So in the case of your egg example, I don't know whether it's a timing issue, that we might have to wait a little bit to see whether you can get cheaper cakes.
Right. What about a regulator?
Right. So in my opinion, where markets can't operate, you need regulators. So if you have price regulation, because regulations have many dimensions to it, you need price regulation where there is limited competition, because there is a natural monopoly or there is an inherent issue with the structure of the market that does not permit sufficient competition or contestability. The difference between competition is the rivalry between players who are already in the market.
Right.
The contestability is a threat of new people coming in, basically. So you need regulators if there is low contestability, low competition. But where there is no issue about entry and that there are sufficient players, the government basically has to see what kind of policies have to be enacted or removed if they are inhibiting competition, or has to be pro-competition. So to give you an example, under the previous government, as a volunteer, I was involved in the drafting of a piece of legislation called the Productivity Commission. That was one of the parts of the Economic Transformation Act. Okay. And it is an institution that is to be based inside Parliament, that would advise the legislature on what needs to be done to increase productivity. And the Productivity Commission was a crucial institution in Australia that created this wonder from down under. That, when I went to university in Australia over 30 years ago, Australia was an expensive place. There was not a lot of choice. It was limited. But over the years, all the sectors were slowly opened out to more competition. So they don't even now have a car industry, because it was protected once upon a time, no more.
Okay.
So we need a lot of pro-competition policies, both in what are called tradable sectors. Those are sectors in which you can import and export the product. And we have very high tariff barriers for the benefit of few individuals. This is a cliche term, Sonali, but I say this, that the problem with Sri Lanka is this country is run for the benefit of 1,000 people. It is not run for the benefit of 22 million people. So all these policies have been put in place because there's state capture, there's regulatory capture, there's policy capture. So when you start having huge protectionism through para tariffs, cess, PAL, etc., you are screwing the consumer. And that is why the Advocata Institute, where I am part of, one of our key mandates is to be the voice of the consumer.
All right, fantastic. We are in conversation with Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
platform.
විසේකාර හැඩකාර දඟකාර ලඳුන්ගේ විස්මිත දක්ෂතා අලංකාරය දකින්න 2024 ICC කාන්තා T20 ලෝක කුසලාන ක්‍රිකට් තරඟාවලිය ඔක්තෝබර් 3 වෙනිදා සිට 20 වෙනිදා තෙක් එක්සත් අරාබි එමිරාජ්‍යයේදී පැවැත්වෙන තරඟාවලිය සජීවීව දකින්න. තරඟාවලියේ නිලදේශීය විකාශය TV1 ඔස්සේ බලාපොරොත්තු වන්න. සියලු තරඟ සජීවීව www.sirasatv.lk වෙබ් අඩවිය ඔස්සේද නැරඹිය හැකියි.
Step away from the conventional art of storytelling. Get ready for the Newsfirst Breakfast Rundown with me, Zulfik Farzan.
Companies play better politics than the politicians of today.
We are not supposed to play with the people's expectation. Then it will be a huge disaster.
When you're bankrupt and when you're going to bankruptcy, two different.
The grandfather is saying it is going to take this long. What does he know?
It's about lack of sense of humor in Sri Lankans.
Issues that matter the most. Unfiltered discussions. Real answers. Face to face. Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on TV1.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back. We are in conversation with Murtaza Jafferjee, Chairman of the Advocata Institute. Before the break, you were taking us through the Productivity Commission proposal, which never saw the light of day.
No, it's just that the legislation was only passed very recently. So many of the institutions, the new institutions under the economic transformation law have to come into place. There's an Invest Sri Lanka, Zone Sri Lanka, Productivity Commission, something else on trade. You know, the economic transformation law was only passed like 2-3 months ago. So hopefully the new president will put those into play.
Okay. Speak to us when we talk about productivity. It's I'd like to connect it to this concept of bringing forth KPIs, key performance indicators, for state sector employees. How important is that?
Okay. So I honestly, if you asked me to do this, I wouldn't know how to do it. Right? So I would try to have performance indicators for institutions, not the people working in them.
Right.
Because finally the delivery has to come from the institutions and it should be outcome based. But ideally, Sonali, since I was a member of the state-owned restructuring unit, I can tell I've had first-hand experience, and I have also participated in various studies. One was the World Bank's report on state-owned enterprises. I mean, many of these commercial enterprises simply should not be owned by government. It makes no sense.
Right.
Because government is a bad owner. I have 30 years of experience in the capital market. My private experience has shown me that the best investments are investments in which you have good owners. You need good businesses also, but what matters is good owners. Government is a terrible owner. There's a misalignment of interests. The incentive structures are all flawed. And government is a policy maker and a regulator. They cannot be an operator. There's also the issue that when government owns businesses, basically, they go and distort the playing field with private sector players. There's a technical term for that called competitive neutrality. There's also the issue of corruption vulnerabilities, because what happens is that these state-owned enterprises are normally mapped to line ministries, and it becomes the fiefdom of the minister. That is how political and economic rents are extracted, political patronage. Now, I served on a voluntary capacity for two years, and I saw the kind of patronage. There were certain construction firms where thousands of people from a particular electorate were just employed, a lot of minor staff. These enterprises have gone bankrupt basically. So there is no point putting in performance indicators for these commercial enterprises. The best thing is for the government to divest them. Okay. But there is a mistake, what I call state-owned enterprises, in that classification from the Ministry of Finance. There are there's only about 70 commercial enterprises. The rest are all statutory institutions. Some of them are regulators, testing bodies, etc. Those are not state-owned enterprises. Those you will probably have to keep with government, and there has to be some performance-based indicators and feedback. Some of these feedback also should come from the public who use these services. Like there should be some kind of satisfaction score, etc., so that they are held accountable to perform to the needs of the public.
In the interest of making this conversation, this discourse more accessible to the audience, I'd just like to share an example. Just last week, there was a check that had to be given from one of the government agencies to one of our companies, where they had made a spelling mistake on the check. So then we had to send the check back again. And then the lady there had refused to issue a fresh check. She had said, "Ape madam, dang me vedak, heta gihillen." So that the messenger had to spend another day to go to the government agency and collect that check. So things like that. The absolute lack of conscionability is another aspect that I'd like to talk about, because this is there across the board. I'm not saying there aren't amazing, incredible state servants. There are, but we see a lot of these examples where the public is helpless at the hands of these state officials who abuse power. How do we bring about a shift in this attitude now that there is greater public demand for accountability by government, by the state sector?
Yeah. So I also have my own horror stories and they're horror stories that would be collected over many years. I think every citizen in this country will have their own tales to say. So the problem is that one is that, it is up to actually what the president should do is he should come up with what is called a social compact.
A social
compact.
Okay.
Some people call it social contract.
Right.
I pay my taxes. I will be given something in return.
Sure.
I have seen the social contract or compact of Singapore 30 years ago, and they have updated it over the years. What is the role of the state? What is the responsibility of the state? What is the role of the citizens? We don't have one in Sri Lanka. And Professor Mick Moore, basically, who has done work on Sri Lanka, always says that countries in which their citizens pay taxes enjoy better governance.
Countries
in which their citizens pay taxes enjoy better governance.
Okay.
Because there will be a much more powerful call for accountability. That the problem we had is there was a complete lack of callousness, because people really didn't care, because they didn't pay their rightful amount of taxes, especially the more wealthy and powerful and more influential. So they had a no care attitude. Now that more people are being called to pay taxes and the tax burden, hopefully that reaction will come, and that reaction should be coming by just demanding that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. Now the president has promised, Sonali, to set the tone at the top. That is so important, because it is not only rules and regulations but setting the tone at the top. And that's why he's only a few days into his things, and with his speeches that he gave before he got into He says, I'm from a very different kind of background. So if he sets the correct tone at the top, basically, I think from two sides. One is the citizens demanding for better performance, and on the other side, the leader of the country setting a good example, basically, will start making a difference. But that alone is not going to be enough, because many of these things are the system and processes.
Okay.
So somebody has to, like we in the private sector, because of competition, we have applied this lean management. So there are 3 management methodologies that are needed. Lean management, how to do things a bit more efficient, and lean came from the famous Toyota production system. How to eliminate waste, and waste has many dimensions besides just physical waste. Waiting time is a waste, basically. Unnecessary long process is a waste. Second thing is talent. The public sector has not been a great repository of talent. There is a few talented people, but historically the public sector, during the time of the Ceylon civil service, it was a real prestigious. You had the best graduates from university joining the civil service. That stopped 40-50 years ago once they politicized the civil service, and the prestige went. The third dimension is performance management. And there is no performance management culture in government, basically, because the incentive structures are all wrong. And don't forget that in the public sector has much higher unionization basically than the private sector. And these unions are not operating, and they are highly political also. They are not necessarily working for protecting the rights of workers, but it is about protecting the entitlement of workers. So these things have to change, basically.
Let's also discuss how over the past few decades we've seen a lack of policy coherence again across the board, and I'd like to take the example of disability inclusion, where we are a party to the convention. We have a statute in this respect. We have regulations and guidelines. And the specific example I want to take is the compulsory need to have a ramp to make a building wheelchair accessible. However, we don't factor in how the person with disability is going to get to that place from his or her residence. How does he or she get into a bus or train? These things there are so many gaps. So why do we take a piecemeal approach? Another aspect is that of tourism. We take out billboards at international airports, and we go to trade fairs and talk about how beautiful Sri Lanka is, and it is. But then tourists come to Sri Lanka, and then 5-10 women put up a Reddit post or go on Facebook or TikTok and say that they got groped and that the police wasn't helpful and that they don't feel safe in Sri Lanka. And that's terrible PR for Sri Lanka. And also, why isn't the police doing its job?
So let me try to answer 2 questions. One, you asked about the disability. Now again, I sat on a voluntary committee when the previous president Ranil Wickremesinghe was the prime minister in the Yahapalana government. It was called something called Agency for Development. It didn't get any statute, basically. He couldn't get the statute passed, but it was supposed to be a fast tracking investment agency. And we had a conversation at that time with the project manager building Shangri-La, the whole Shangri-La project. And I remember that gentleman saying that you have gold standard regulations as far as disability is concerned when you build a hotel. So there is a certain ratio of disabled toilets that you have to have, or rooms with disabled toilets to normal rooms.
Okay.
And what he said is, our standard is much more rigorous than even Singapore. This gentleman was from Singapore. So we have copied it from some gold standard, and he was complaining that, look, able people don't like to stay in a room with disabled toilets, basically, and that ratio is too high. So I don't think it's a lack of legislation, but your comment was more end to end. So obviously nobody has thought system wide, because let's face it, in our society basically there is a taboo about disability. It is not accepted openly. So with regard to your second question about behavior, again these are all cultural issues, and there is no explicit effort that has been made to say that these are wrong. So to give you an example, there were lots of very bad incidents in India, especially in North India, that there is the male culture there is very different to the South basically. And what they did is they had leading actors, Bollywood actors, make a advertisement. So I remember Salman Khan, Shah Rukh Khan, one of the other Khans, Amir Khan, coming and saying that it's not cool to harass women, it's not cool to hassle people. So I think that, we need to have a similar kind of effort that is done through schools, that is done through mass media, to show that this is unacceptable behavior. And that is my suggestion, how to prevent this behavioral problem. Of course, the reprimand that you talked about, Sonali, I would think that it will be less successful because our court system, and you have to prosecute, and then you have to have a witness and all of that. I would try to focus more on prevention basically. And we have to have role models, it's men who are doing this, basically that it's not cool to do this.
Going forward, in your opinion, what industries should Sri Lanka focus on?
Just to give it a bit of context, last quarter, 30th June, we posted 4.3% growth. But that growth was because last year in the second quarter there was a massive economic contraction. So we are rebounding from negative growth.
Okay.
And if you take the size of economic output in Q2 this year, it is still 5% lower than Q2 of 2018.
Okay.
So for 6 years basically we have not grown. We are still behind. We'll probably take till next year to go back to where we were. Now going forward basically we have two challenges. One is the existing sectors in the economy, how do you grow it? And since we are so indebted, you are not going to have cheap capital.
Okay.
Right? Capital is going to be expensive because the government has so much a debt that has to get rolled over. So you're not going to have cheap interest. The second issue that we have is that we need to find new sectors in the economy basically, or what economists call structural transformation, where the structure of our economy will have to change. So the existing brownfield sectors will have to grow through productivity improvement.
Okay.
And the greenfield sectors will also have to be into areas which we currently don't have. Both of those require foreign investment. To improve productivity, we have to open our economy to competition through trade, and we have to encourage new foreign players who bring new technology, management methodologies, different skill of working to improve. And these could be in retailing, in house building. These are all mature parts of the economy, but they are large parts. They employ a lot of people. As far as the greenfield sectors are concerned, they have to be export-oriented industries. And we have a great opportunity because most of the country, most of the developed world is trying to move some of their sourcing away from China because they don't want to be excessively restricted to one country. So the best way to do that is by building industrial zones and that is already embedded in the economic transformation law. There is a Invest Sri Lanka and Zone Sri Lanka part of the law. So we need to build many more industrial zones. All the industrial zones that the BOI have are highly successful. They operate at about 90%. And just for the benefit of your audience, why industrial zones matter is a lot of the approvals are pre-approved. So it's like plug and play. So the risks are all reduced. The land is available. You don't have to worry about forests and wildlife and archaeology and so many other challenges that you might face. So we need to execute very well on how to attract much more foreign direct investment into Sri Lanka, and we also have to focus on how to improve productivity across the economy, including in the SME sector, which has notoriously low productivity.
How do we connect all of these dots using the power of digitization?
So digitization, there are two buckets basically. One is a citizen bucket, one is the business bucket. So you would have seen that the shippers forum, basically them talking about the single window. What the single window basically means is that when you do trade, there are certain statutory documents etc. that have to be submitted. They want to have it in a digital format so that you are not reliant on a particular person to approve it, because invariably when you have a person, corruption vulnerabilities increase. And then the same information is being multiple filled again. So I have a long ago a background in IT. This is no whiz bang stuff. These are things that could be done 20-30 years ago. So to get companies to operate more efficiently by interacting through digital technology. The second is where citizens are concerned, and I think one of the foundational infrastructure is the so-called digital ID. So the Indians have done it very well. They call it the public digital infrastructure, and it is amazing that they continue to keep build on it. For your information, the Indians are willing to give us a grant.
Okay.
The grant was approved. What happened is that I believe it was 3 billion Indian rupees. We basically did a tender and made it too restrictive. Nobody qualified. So then I believe the former president told the Indians, you procure and give. And I don't know what the current status is, but that's pretty much ready to go. Once we find the contractor, it will probably, what I was told last was it will take about one year basically to implement the software, and then you have to onboard 22 million people, which might take like 1 year because you have to get all the biometrics etc.
Sure.
But then Sonali, I have been hearing about this 25 years ago.
Okay.
Because I told you I had a background in IT and I had an interest. 25 years ago I first heard about this getting a digital ID. So now 25 years has gone. At least I hope in the next 2 years that falls into place, because these foundational technologies allow the private sector to build on top of that. And you can't have private people doing this. The government has to do this, because the foundational ID of our country is the national ID card. The foundational address is with the Grama Sekar. So there are parts of government that has to put this in place. Then the private sector can build on top of that.
My final question, Mr. Jafferjee, what is the economic outlook for Sri Lanka? Can we be hopeful? We must be hopeful, surely. What more can we, the citizens, do?
So, as I said, one of the things that Advocata is trying to do is economic literacy is very weak. Okay, people just don't understand.
Yeah.
Right. So we are trying to improve economic literacy. Okay. That's one of our core goals, and we also trying to champion the voice of the consumer, because consumers are all fragmented, but producers are all together. So policy is formulated for the interest of a few, not for the interest of the majority. Because this economic policy thinking is very weak inside government, And one of the things I hope that the new government will consider is, like in the UK, that we implement what is called an economic service. That you have a pool of economists, basically professional economists within government, who are seconded to different ministries, so that an economist policy lens can come in when policy is evaluated. So going forward, basically what we need to do is that we have to accelerate economic growth. We can't stick to the IMF's base projections of 3%, because if we do, we are going to default again, because we have so much of debt, and the debt is at very high interest rates. So one of the measures of debt sustainability is to make sure that your real GDP growth is in excess of your real interest rates. Right? Because on the numerator is your debt, and your denominator is your GDP. So the debt can't grow faster than your GDP. Now the problem is, already after restructuring, our debt is still 110% of GDP. And the debt is still, because of the domestic debt, is carrying very high interest rates. So we have to accelerate economic growth, because when the economy is doing well, your tax collection also increases. So we have been talking about this primary balance surplus of 2.3%. In order to collect more taxes, it is not only about the tax policy, which is the rates. It is not about tax administration also, that the correct people are paying their rightful taxes, but it's also having more income that can be taxed. So when the economy is doing well, people will buy discretionary products. Those have more taxes on that. People will own overtime. People will get bonuses. All that then at the margin will get taxed at the highest rate of interest. So economists call it tax buoyancy. So because economic growth will create tax buoyancy, economic growth will give more opportunities for more people, economic growth will give more opportunities for the poor people to have a better quality of life. Economic growth will also make sure that the debt becomes more sustainable. And when that starts happening, people then perceive that we are not as risky. So the interest, the risk premium attached to our interest starts going down. And that's how we can come out of this crisis. But finally, all of that will require this whole country to work in one way. And what I am most thankful for this presidential election is that there was a complete absence of divisive politics. It was divisive politics that ruined this country over the last 70 years. And there was none of that stuff, or I certainly didn't hear it. And I hope going into the parliamentary election also, we don't have that stuff. That means that, you are trying to bring people together, then divide them. And to me, that is a necessary condition.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise and perspectives, Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee. Thank you. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again next Friday. Good night.